Hello, welcome back to the CleaveTech channel. It's been a very long time, I know, since my last video, and I'm going to get into the reasons why in future videos, but for now we're going to crack on with this video today. Well, you've probably read the title of this video, but if this chassis here is going to be the winning Mid-America BSCRA Clubman National chassis, it's not going to be in my hands because I'm not allowed to drive it. Extra. In the British Slot Car Racing Association's driver grading, I am a Premier Grade driver. That means that I've achieved certain successes at national level in national competitions, winning national titles, etc. This race is for Clubman drivers who haven't achieved any of that success. They might be really good drivers at their local club. They may have come out and done a few meetings outside their local club. Maybe they've scored a few ranking points, but they haven't actually achieved success on a national level at a national championships. So this is the Clubman Championships, especially for those drivers where myself and other Premier Grade drivers and other main grade drivers will be helping out all the Clubman racers for their own national championships. And the winner of the Clubman Nationals in each one of the classes gets promoted to main grade, which is the next grade up, for the following year. But it does mean they can carry on being a Clubman driver for the whole of the rest of the year and compete in Clubman events. But as I say, this chassis, if it does become the winning chassis, won't be in my hands. So who's going to be driving this chassis? Well, at the moment, I don't know either. As part of BSCRA's continued trial to try and get people out of their local clubs and out racing, we run a national Clubman Championship, as I mentioned before, and this is dedicated to just Clubman drivers. So as part of that event, I'm putting together this INTRO32 car here for Clubman drivers to win in a raffle. Now that means they don't need particular skill to win, they just need a little bit of luck, and anybody can then have this chassis and race it the following day in the INTRO32 Championship. They might have their own car might even be wonderfully faster than this. But I'm putting together this chassis, this motor, these parts to give somebody an excellent chance at having a good competitive car to race at the Clubman Nationals. Is this video sponsored by Mid-America? No, it's not. But the Clubman Nationals is sponsored by Mid-America, so I'm mentioning them quite a lot because they're helping out the BSCRA with some decent prizes to try and get Clubman racers out racing. So let's get cracking with this BSCRA Genesis chassis for the INTRO32 class here in the UK. I'm not going to spend ages going through on this video all the tiny little bits that I do to make up all the parts for this chassis because I've shown that in previous videos. And I'll put a link to one of the key previous videos up here in the top corner. But what I will go through in this video is some things to check, just to show you some of the things I'm doing to get this chassis ready and some of the things you can do perhaps to your own INTRO32 chassis or Genesis chassis that you might have already. I know these chassis here have sold all over the world. They're a 1/32 scale chassis, but I do know that a lot of people are using these on their small, perhaps their home tracks, their club tracks, etc., rather than perhaps the big banked raceways. So before I put anything onto this chassis or start building it up, the key thing to do is to make sure they're nice and flat. These are laser cut chassis, they're made to a price, they're assembled to a price, and what tends to happen is when they're soldered up, they tend to bend a fraction across here. The stresses in the material just causes a small bend like this along the back of the chassis. So you tend to get these little ears here tend to be bent down a fraction, and the middle of the chassis tends to be up in the air a fraction there as well. So I've got this nice flat block here, so I'm going to put it on the flat block and I'm going to see, is there any daylight under any of the areas along the back of this chassis. You can also see in preparation I've rounded off all of the leading edges of the chassis here with a small little polishing Dremel bit. That's allowed in the rules as long as you don't take more than 50% of the thickness of the chassis when you've rounded it off. Okay, so you can round all those off, and it just basically makes the chassis slide over the track much better. It also protects the track surface as well if you're going to run low or you have a bit of an accident and the size of a car tend to dig into the track. So I put the chassis on my nice flat granite surface block, and I've got a very, very thin feeler gauge here. This is 5/100ths of a millimetre, and I'm going to just slide that under the chassis, and you can see, look, how that slides under the chassis without moving the chassis. When I get to this point here, it just catches. I can feel it catching on the chassis. It does push the chassis up under those rounded edges, but I can feel it catching. And this side, so you can see it's catching the chassis and moving it, but here it slides in. Oh, mind my thumb. It slides in dead easily, doesn't move the chassis at all, but it does, it just hits that pillar block there, and that one just catches here on the back edge, but in the middle here it's slightly in the air. So how am I going to fix that? Well, I'm probably just going to use my hands, and I'm going to slightly push down that middle bit of the chassis there, just tweak up these two edges, put it back on the block again, and try again.
12 seconds later.
So I've been along all this back edge here, and I'm happy that I've got it pretty flat now. So I can just check with my feeler gauge. Just catches that bit there. I don't know whether you can hear, but it is now moving. You can see it's just moving the chassis there when I push it under. Moves the chassis there, moves the chassis there. So I know that it's nice and flat across the whole back. The other thing you can do, you could always put a straight edge along there and line it up with a nice sort of straight edge, and you can compare, see if there's any daylight underneath between there. Again, you could get down onto the level of your block, you could shine a light, and you could look down sort of sideways like this at the level of your block and see, is there any light or daylight under the back of the chassis. So if you're happy that the back of the chassis is flat, now I would always set it up just a fraction so that when you press on one of the ears either side, you can just fractionally see the one the other side lift, which means they're just fractionally in the air. But we're talking less than this feeler gauge thickness of difference, but you can see it if you just press here, and then you can see this one lift fraction, and again you press on the left hand side and watch the right hand side lift. So it just means there's a fraction of a rock there in the chassis. The next thing to check whilst you're there and flat on the block is if you do push down here on the very back of the chassis, you've got to make sure that the guide doesn't lift up. So basically when you're pushing down here, you don't want the guide to lift up, because that means that there's a bend somewhere in the middle of the chassis here, and to be honest, it's probably across here. You might have this back part here totally nice and flat, but if actually at this point here the chassis is bent up, it's going to rock like this on the block. So the next thing to do is just press down where the pillar blocks are, or in the middle of the pillar blocks, and make sure that that guide tab here doesn't lift up at all. You can also just check again just in front of the motor to make sure that's nice and flat again, and you've got everything on this center part here nice and flat. The other thing I'm going to check is these two front parts here, because they're connected, as you can see, all the way around here like this. And what can happen with those is they can twist, they can bend a little bit. You can see there's quite a bit of flex in the chassis there. I mean, that's intentional because it gives it its little bit of handling, but again you want to make sure that it's all nice and flat and sits nice and flat on the block, and then when you press down like this on each one of the pieces, it shouldn't move anything else. Everything should stay exactly as it is. And on camera you can see, does the reflection of any of it change? It doesn't seem to. I'll move my hand around here. Yeah, you're looking for changes in the reflection here in the light. It doesn't seem to do that. So again, I know that it's flat because I've just checked it all on the block. And if it isn't, again, I just tend to use my fingers to bend it flat. I haven't really needed to use many tools on it, but if you do, a pair of pliers like this, or maybe a nice sort of flat nose pliers are quite good to use, because then you don't dig into the chassis and make marks on the chassis if you hold it wrong. It's also worth noting at this point, things that the technical inspection guys will be looking out for when they scrutineer your car, because in the past we've seen people change these chassis in certain ways that you're not really allowed to do. The whole point of this racing is that we're racing all chassis that are standard, unchanged from the manufacturer's intentions. So I've seen people in the past desolder these little front pan hangers here, maybe put them at a slight angle so you get slightly more or less movement in the pan. You know, so they've taken these out and adjusted these. They've maybe bashed them down on the inside edge, maybe they've opened them up on the outside edge so there's a bit more pan movement, maybe they've done the opposite just to suit their own particular driving style. So we're looking for that these pan hangers here haven't been modified. Also, I've seen people modify the amount of movement in the guide at the front. So here you can see the guide is moving up and down, and we notice that it should come fractionally below the front of the chassis when it's pushed down, and it should go fractionally above the chassis, there we go, when it's pushed up. So it should move between, and we know what this gap here is, so if that gap's changed we can measure it and see if you're pushing the limits too far with moving anything, because you're not allowed to move it or change the movement in the chassis at all. So there's a couple of things at the front of the chassis that we're looking for. Also, again, people can do similar things at the rear of the chassis, and they've changed these hooks here. They've either ground them or they've taken them out, moved them down, pushed them down, lifted them up. But basically, they've changed the amount of movement that the chassis has at the back and the front on the pans. You're not allowed to do that. You're also not allowed to have any tape across the chassis that restricts the movement of the chassis in any way. So you're not allowed to damp pan movement by putting some gel tape across here or across the front here. So you're not allowed to restrict the movement in any way. I have seen some people put some tape on the parts of the chassis. Now that's allowed because you're allowed to add some ballast, but it mustn't change the movement of the chassis in any way, shape or form. Okay. Also, these little pin tube holders here are very, very thin. Now I think some of the later versions of the chassis have slightly thicker pin tube holders here, but the earlier ones are quite thin, and I have seen them break. So what we have allowed people to do is repair the pin tube holders. They put a little bit of tiny bit of piano wire over the top, or a little bit of brass shim over the top, or steel shim, and solder them back in exactly the same place. That is allowed to repair your chassis to keep it going. We've also had other incidents where gear guards are broken off. This one hasn't got a gear guard at all, but some have a little gear guard that comes out here and they snap off. Again, that's fine. You can run with the gear guard removed or cut off, as long as you haven't changed or cut any of the pillar blocks away or anything else around where the motor screws in here either. So again, those little tiny things are permitted just to keep your chassis running rather than having to scrap it and throw it in the bin and get another one. So the next job, now that the chassis is nice and flat and straight, we're going to stick in the 332 axle bushes. You're not allowed bearings in this chassis, it must be axle bushes, but they are a free choice, and you can solder them into the chassis or you can glue them into the chassis, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to solder them in just to make sure they're nice and securely fixed for whoever's going to be racing it. Well, thank you very much for either coming back to the channel, staying with the channel, seeing my channel for the first time. But we're going to leave it there for today. The second part, finishing off this car, will be coming along very, very shortly. In fact, probably tomorrow. So if you did like this video, please put your thumbs up at the bottom to say you like the video. Please subscribe to my channel. It's very much appreciated, and there'll be plenty more videos coming very soon.